Samantha jolted awake, her breath caught in her throat, as her eyes darted toward the window. There it was again, a figure, barely visible through the foggy glass, standing just beyond the pane, motionless. She blinked, her heart pounding in her chest. Was it real, or was her mind playing tricks on her? She stared harder, the pale moonlight barely illuminating the shadowy outline. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Samantha exhaled, gripping the edges of her blanket. She told herself it was nothing. It had to be just her imagination running wild. But deep down, something about that figure unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. She couldn't shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever, had been standing there was watching her, and that it would come back. The small town of Willowbrook had always been a quiet, uneventful place. Nestled between dense woods and rolling hills, it was the kind of place where people knew each other's names, and strangers were rare. Samantha had moved here for a fresh start after the chaos of city life had worn her down. She needed peace, and Willowbrook seemed to offer exactly that. Her new home, an old Victorian house perched on the outskirts of town, was charming, if not a little eerie. Its creaky floors and long hallways had a certain character she found intriguing, at least at first. It didn't take long for strange things to start happening. At night, she would hear soft tapping sounds coming from the windows, the faintest whispers of movement in the walls, and once, in the dead of night, she could have sworn she heard a distant, high-pitched giggle. But it was the man in the window who haunted her the most. It began subtly, a flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye, a fleeting shadow in the moonlight. At first, she chalked it up to her imagination. After all, she had been under a lot of stress. But as the days passed, the sightings grew more frequent and undeniable. The house itself seemed to come alive at night. The old wooden structure groaned under the weight of its age, and the wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it an unsettling chill. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing night, and Samantha found herself constantly glancing over her shoulder as if someone, or something, was watching her. The tapping at the windows became a nightly occurrence, always just soft enough to be dismissed, but persistent enough to gnaw at her nerves. One evening, while she was unpacking in the living room, the sound grew louder, more insistent. She froze, her heart racing, as the sound moved from one window to another, as though something, or someone, was circling the house, checking for a way in. And then, without warning, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Samantha stood motionless, listening, her pulse quickening. She edged toward the window, slowly, cautiously, and peered outside. The yard was empty. Nothing but the overgrown grass and the thick woods beyond. But just as she was about to turn away, she saw it again, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching. Samantha wasn't the type to scare easily. In her former life as a journalist, she had covered crime scenes, riots, and all manner of dangerous situations. But this was different. The isolation of Willowbrook, combined with the eerie occurrences, was starting to wear on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the house, or maybe even the town itself. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Samantha began talking to the locals. At the coffee shop, she met Mrs. Garver, an elderly woman who had lived in Willowbrook all her life. When Samantha mentioned the strange events, Mrs. Garver's face paled. "That house," Mrs. Garver whispered, leaning in closer. "It's got a history. Dark things happened there. People went missing. Folks say it's cursed." Samantha laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "A cursed house? Come on, that sounds like something out of a ghost story." But Mrs. Garver didn't smile. "Believe what you want, dear, but mark my words, nothing good ever comes to those who stay in that house too long." As the days went by, the occurrences grew more terrifying. Objects in the house would move on their own, small things at first, like picture frames and books. But then one night, Samantha woke to find all the chairs in the dining room stacked on top of one another, as if some unseen force had carefully arranged them while she slept. The sight sent a chill down her spine. Determined not to let fear control her, Samantha installed security cameras around the house, hoping to catch whatever, or whoever, was behind the disturbances. The first few nights, the footage showed nothing unusual. But on the fourth night, as she reviewed the recordings, her blood ran cold. There, in the grainy footage from the camera by the living room window, was the figure, the man. He was standing just outside, staring directly into the camera, his face obscured by shadow. And then, without moving an inch, he vanished, as though he had never been there at all. Samantha's hands trembled as she paused the footage, rewinding and replaying the moment again and again. Each time, the same thing. The figure appeared, stood for a few moments, and then disappeared. The tension in the house became unbearable. Every night, Samantha would lay awake, listening to the sounds that seemed to crawl through the walls, waiting for the man to return. The tapping at the windows grew louder, more insistent, as though the figure was becoming bolder. And then, one night, she heard it, a voice, faint and distant, calling her name. Samantha bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering in her chest. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. But the voice came again, this time closer, more urgent. It seemed to be coming from inside the house. Grabbing a flashlight, Samantha crept down the stairs, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The house was deathly silent, the kind of silence that presses down on your ears, making every creak of the floorboards sound deafening. She followed the sound, heart in her throat, until she reached the living room. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was the man. Samantha's mind raced, struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. The man was tall and thin, his face pale and expressionless. His eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to bore into her soul, and for a moment she couldn't move. Fear rooted her to the spot, paralyzing her. He didn't say a word, didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, staring. Stay away," she stammered, taking a step back, her hands trembling. But the man didn't respond. Instead, he began to smile, a slow, eerie grin that sent a wave of nausea crashing over her. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished, leaving Samantha standing alone in the dark, her heart racing and her mind reeling. Was it a hallucination, a dream, or had the man really been there, standing in her living room, watching her? From that moment on, Samantha's grip on reality began to slip. She started questioning everything. Was the man real, or was her mind playing tricks on her? Every shadow seemed to shift. Every sound seemed to carry a hidden threat. She couldn't trust her senses anymore, and that terrified her more than anything. The man's presence became more frequent, but always fleeting, just on the edge of perception. Sometimes she would catch glimpses of him in the reflection of a mirror or in the corner of her eye, but when she turned to look, he was gone. Other times, she would hear his footsteps echoing in the hallways, soft but unmistakable. The worst part was that she never knew when he would appear. Every moment became a waiting game, an endless stretch of anxiety as she waited for the man to show himself. The fear of the unknown gnawed at her, wearing her down little by little. She tried leaving the house, spending nights in hotels or with friends, but the man followed her. No matter where she went, she could feel his presence, always lurking, always watching. There was no escape. In her desperation, Samantha began researching the history of the house. She pored over old newspapers and town records, searching for any mention of the strange occurrences she had been experiencing. It was then that she uncovered the chilling truth. Decades ago, a man had lived in the house, a recluse named Victor Hall, who had been known for his eccentric behavior. Neighbors claimed he was obsessed with the occult, conducting strange rituals in the dead of night. People began to avoid the house, and eventually, Victor disappeared without a trace. Some said he had summoned something he couldn't control. Others believed he had gone mad. But the most disturbing part, Victor had always been seen standing by the window, watching the town below. Samantha couldn't deny the connection. Victor's obsession with the occult, the mysterious man in the window, it all lined up. She was living in a house tainted by something beyond her understanding, and the man, whether it was Victor's spirit or something far worse, was bound to the house, haunting it and now haunting her. But what did he want? And why had he chosen her? Desperation led Samantha to seek help from a paranormal investigator, a man named Marcus, who specialized in cleansing haunted locations, agreed to help her. He believed the man in the window was a manifestation of Victor's trapped soul, bound to the house by dark forces. The night Marcus came to perform the cleansing, the house was more oppressive than ever. The air was thick with tension, and the tapping at the windows had become relentless. As Marcus began the ritual, the man appeared once again, standing by the window, watching. Samantha could feel his eyes on her, cold and unforgiving. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She stood her ground, determined to see the ritual through. And then, as Marcus chanted the final words, something unexpected happened. The man stepped away from the window, his expression softening. For the first time, he looked human. He mouthed something, words she couldn't hear, but in that moment she understood. He wasn't there to harm her. He was trapped, just like she had been, caught in a nightmare he couldn't escape. With a final, sorrowful glance, the man disappeared, and the house fell silent. The ritual had worked. The house was cleansed. But as Samantha stood alone in the quiet darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, watching. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't gone for good. If you enjoyed this chilling story, check out my latest video on horror stories, Tales from the Shadows. Click the link on the end screen and prepare to be haunted by more terrifying tales.